Listen closely, because the moment you hear her name, you will feel the air change. Judith. Not a name sung in church hymns or printed in the fine ink of family Bibles, but whispered like a warning in kitchens, marshes, and graveyards. Judith of Alabama. The girl who carried silence like a weapon sharper than any blade. The girl who turned her suffering into ritual, her pain into poison. And if you think this is just another tale of Southern cruelty, then you are not yet listening. This is not history as it was written. This is history as it was buried, clawing its way up through the roots of magnolia trees, through the wet earth of Alabama marshland, through the walls of a plantation house that still rots from the inside out. The year was 1847, the season of Mardi Gras, when Mobile's white aristocracy paraded through the streets with silk masks and hollow laughter, as though their wealth and cruelty could keep the swamp at bay. But behind the painted masks and the ivory fans, there was rot. And at the center of that rot was Rose Hill Plantation, a house that stood like a crown on a hill of bones, where laughter never meant joy and silence never meant peace. Inside that house moved Judith, 17 years old, skin marked with burns, lashes, and bruises that never healed because new ones came too quickly. She was the property of Colonel Josiah Bellwether, a man whose boots tracked more blood than mud, whose voice commanded both the plantation fields and the trembling servants within his house. He believed himself untouchable, as all men of his breed did, but he never noticed Judith's eyes. That was his first mistake. She never wept where they could see, never begged when they struck, never gave them the pleasure of breaking her voice. Her silence unsettled even her mistress, Constance, who punished her with vinegar baths, starvation, and spoons pressed red-hot egg inst her arms. And yet Judith endured, not like the broken endure, but like the earth endures fire, scorched black on the surface, roots alive beneath. Because Judith was listening, every insult, every whispered debt, every meeting the colonel thought was private. She memorized doors, locks, bottles, herbs. She watched which wines the colonel favored and which dishes the mistress adored. And she waited, always waiting, not with desperation, but with purpose. For the swamp outside the plantation had already begun to speak to her in dreams. And once the swamp begins whispering your name, there is no silence left that belongs to you. There is a reason the old people of Alabama warned their children never to wander the marsh trails after dark. The swamp is not empty. It breathes, it remembers, and sometimes, when it chooses, it speaks. Judith had heard it long before she ever set foot on that path. The hiss of water against reeds, the groan of cypress roots, the hum that rose from the soil like voices pressed under the earth. At night, when the plantation fell into its drunken sleep, Judith would slip barefoot past the dogs, past the rusted gates, and vanish into the shadows where the air thickened with damp and memory. Her feet knew where to go, as though the mud itself guided her. Past the sycamores whose branches bent low like ancient arms, past the stagnant pools where frogs refused to sing, deeper and deeper until the plantation house was only a ghost behind her. And there, sagging into the ground as if swallowed by the swamp, stood the crooked cabin. No lantern ever burned within, yet light seemed to gather around it. The kind of light that doesn't come from flame, but from something older, hungrier. Inside waited Mahalia. The people in town called her a root worker. Others whispered witch, but Mahalia called herself nothing at all. Her skin was wrinkled like bark, her eyes milk-white yet piercing, seeing not the surface of things, but the marrow beneath. Judith never spoke when she came to her. She didn't need to. Mahalia already knew. The old woman stirred her cauldron of herbs, bones, and roots, her hands moving with the rhythm of women who had carried pain too long to set it down. "You carry silence like a blade," she said to Judith one night, "small, sharp, and always ready." Judith said nothing, and the old woman nodded, as though silence itself was the truest answer. On her fourth visit, Mahalia reached beneath the floorboards and drew out a bundle wrapped in deer hide. She placed it, in Judith's lap without ceremony. Inside was a glass vial, dark as dried blood, sealed with wax and twine. No label, no instructions, only weight and meaning. Don't use it in anger, Mahalia warned. Use it in truth, and only when the truth is ready to bloom. Judith held the vial against her chest. For the first time she felt warmth, not from her body, but from the vial itself, pulsing faintly, as though it recognized her. And in that moment, she stopped being a servant. She became a vessel. By the time winter settled across Alabama in 1847, the plantation hummed with a fever it had never known before. Invitations had arrived, stamped with gold and sealed with crests. The bellwethers were called to Mobile, to the grand masquerade of Mardi Gras, a night of masks, music, and spectacle reserved for the finest white families of the South, where men toasted to the Confederacy before it even breathed its first, and women sharpened their envy beneath the glitter of pearls. To the colonel, it was an opportunity to display his power. To the mistress, a chance to outshine her rivals. To Judith, it was the appointed hour. She hid the vial beneath a loose floorboard in the laundry room, one of the few places her mistress never dared to enter. Each morning, before she washed linen stiff with sweat and blood, she would lift the board and touch the vial, not to check if it was still there, but to remind herself that she still was. The glass seemed to hum beneath her fingers, faint but certain, as though time itself had bent to her will. She carried herself quieter than ever, smaller, obedient. So obedient, it made her mistress uneasy. The days before Mardi Gras were punishment enough to break lesser souls. Judith's hands bled from stitching satin gowns, her back burned from bending over hot irons, her ears rang from the shrieks of Constance Bellwether, who demanded perfection in her gowns, in her gloves, in every curl of powdered hair. Judith endured each order with a stillness that unsettled even the mistress, because silence can be louder than screams. Silence can become a mirror, forcing tormentors to glimpse the rot in themselves. On the morning of departure, Judith was dressed in a dull servant's uniform, her hair pulled tight until it ached. The carriage rattled through broken towns and fields, stripped bare, past lines of enslaved men shackled and forced onward, beneath rifle sights. Judith kept her gaze on the horizon, where the sky split open like a wound refusing to close. When they reached Mobile, the city was alive with contradiction. Lanterns glowed against rotting docks. Music spilled from windows framed by broken shutters. Wealth and ruin danced together beneath the masks of Mardi Gras. The bellwethers stepped into that world of chandeliers and deceit with their heads high, blind to the shadow that followed them. Judith, holding her mistress's shawl, silent as death in waiting. She had memorized every detail. She knew which goblet would bear the crest of the bellwethers, and she knew that once the music swelled and the wine flowed, silence would bloom into something final. The ballroom was a cathedral of excess. Chandeliers dripped with crystal, their light refracting across silk masks and jeweled fans. Musicians played violins that screeched like laughter, while politicians and planters raised their goblets, each toast a hymn to their own cruelty. Servants in plain livery moved like shadows along the walls, unseen, unremembered. Judith was among them. She held her mistress's train, carried her fan, fetched her wine. To the untrained eye, she was invisible. But Judith had never been more present. The bellwethers dined at the head table, beneath banners stitched with family crests. Constance preened like a peacock, her gown glittering with imported beads. Colonel Josiah leaned heavy on his chair, his booming laugh shaking the cutlery. His goblet, marked with the bellwether crest, sat before him, waiting, just as Judith had been waiting. The feast arrived in courses of cruelty. Turtle soup, duck dripping in fat, roasted venison carved at the table by a sweating boy no older than 10. Judith moved among the platters, her silence cloaked in obedience. Her eyes, though, were fixed on the wine. Each time the servants poured, she drew closer. Each time the colonel drank, she counted. The vial beneath her apron pulsed like a second heartbeat, its warmth searing into her skin. When the final course arrived, sweetmeats and candied oranges, the moment ripened. Judith's hand slid into her apron, fingers curling around the vial. The wax cracked under her nail with a sound no one heard. She leaned over the colonel's goblet, steady as stone, and tipped the vial. The liquid moved like shadow, dissolving instantly into the deep red wine. No ripple, no scent, only silence. She withdrew, smooth as any servant, and placed the goblet at his hand. Josiah Bellwether lifted it without a glance. His mask, painted in gold, caught the light as he raised the glass high. "To the glory of the South!" he thundered, and the hall roared in answer. He drank deep, so deep. The music swelled. Judith lowered her eyes, her face unreadable. Around her, laughter spilled and masks shimmered, but she heard only the swamp, its hum rising, its roots shifting, its voice speaking through her pulse. The truth had been planted, and like all seeds, it was only a matter of time before it bloomed. At first, nothing. The colonel laughed, bellowing so loud that the chandeliers quivered. He tore into candied fruit with his teeth, his beard glistening with syrup, his wife dabbing delicately at her lips, already drunk on envy and wine. The room spun with color, violins shrieked, and masks shimmered as dancers whirled. To anyone watching, the Bellwethers glowed with triumph. But Judith, standing silent at the table's edge, saw the first flicker. It was in his eyes, a sudden blink, too slow, a pause between laughter and breath. He reached for his goblet again, but his hand trembled, wine sloshing crimson across the tablecloth like spilled blood. He cursed, too softly for anyone but Judith to hear. Then his laughter returned, louder, sharper, as though he could drown the tremor inside him. The poison worked patiently. It was not fire, not instant ruin. It was silence turned inward, smothering from the inside out. His throat began to tighten, each swallow heavier than the last. His skin flushed, then paled, his face glistening with sweat despite the cool February air that swept through the ballroom windows. Still he pressed on, forcing another toast, his voice ragged, his mask slipping crooked across his face. Constance noticed first. "Josiah," she hissed, her jeweled fingers clutching his sleeve. But he shook her off with a growl, unwilling to show weakness. He rose to his feet, swaying like a mast in storm wind, goblet raised high once more. "To the—" His words fractured. A cough burst from his chest, spraying wine across the white lace of the table. A few guests gasped. Others laughed nervously, believing it a drunken fit. But Judith knew. She could feel it, the vial's whisper moving through his veins, curling around his lungs, seizing his heart. She did not move, did not blink. She simply held her mistress's fan, her head bowed, though behind her stillness, her beningbe, silence roared. Then the colonel collapsed. The great chair toppled backward, goblet shattering on marble, crimson wine bleeding into the cracks like veins spreading. The ballroom stilled, masks froze mid-dance, music screeched to silence. And in that frozen moment, Judith felt the swamp inside her chest bloom. The poison had taken root. But death, she knew, was never simple. A body may fall, but the echoes linger. And the echoes of Josiah Bellwether's fall would not be contained within chandeliers and velvet. They would seep into every corridor, every slave quarter, every acre of earth that bore his name. The ballroom erupted like a hive struck by fire. Screams split the air as Josiah Bellwether convulsed on the marble floor, his mask twisted beside him like a fallen crown. Some rushed forward, others recoiled, skirts dragging through spilled wine that looked too much like blood. Constance shrieked, clawing at her husband's chest, demanding a doctor, demanding prayer, demanding order where none existed. But no prayer could pierce the silence, curling through his veins. A physician, summoned from among the guests, dropped to his knees. He pried open the colonel's mouth, pressed his ear against the struggling chest, and paled. "Apoplexy," he stammered. "A seizure. Too much wine, too much merriment." His words flailed, desperate to cover what his eyes already knew. Death had entered the room, and it wore no mask. But the crowd was not convinced. Whispers moved quicker than music ever could. Words like poison, words like curse. Someone muttered of the swamp, of root workers in the shadows of Mobile, of women who carried silence like knives. Eyes darted toward the servants, who stood motionless against the walls, faces unreadable. Judith among them, her hands folded neatly, her gaze lowered. Constance's wail cut through the whispers. "Do something!" she shrieked, shaking the lifeless body as if she could rattle breath back into his chest. But Josiah Bellwether's eyes had already clouded, his jaw slackening in a grotesque final smile. His limbs jerked once more, then stilled. The great colonel, master of Rose Hill, lay broken on the ballroom floor, his final feast curdled within him. The music would not return that night. Masks slipped away, revealing pale, sweating faces. Guests pressed to the doors, eager to flee before death chose another. Some crossed themselves, others muttered prayers, but all felt the same thing, that something had entered with them, something older than medicine, older than God's grace. And through it all, Judith stood untouched, the fan still in her hand, the silence still in her body. No one looked at her directly, not yet. To them, she was nothing more than a shadow in plain dress. But shadows see everything. Shadows remember. And in Judith's silence, the swamp sang. The Bellwethers had built their world on bones and blood, believing themselves untouchable. Tonight the bones had risen. Tonight, blood had answered. The colonel's body did not leave Mobile in silence. It left under the weight of stares, whispers, and the stink of fear. His coffin was hammered together hastily, pine boards creaking under the strain of his bloated corpse. The masquerade had dissolved into gossip before the body had even cooled, each tongue sharpening its own story. Stroke, fit, poison, witchcraft. By the time the Bellwether carriage rattled out of the city, carrying Constance veiled in black and Judith silent at her side, the tale had already rooted itself in every tavern and chapel pew. Josiah Bellwether had been taken. Rose Hill Plantation awaited them with shutters drawn like eyelids against the sun. The fields stilled, the quarters hushed, as though the earth itself held its breath. The enslaved stood in rows when the carriage arrived, their faces masks of stone, yet in their eyes flickered something dangerous, something that had not lived there before. They watched as pallbearers struggled with the coffin, their boots sinking deep into mud that seemed eager to claim more than wood and flesh. The funeral passed in brittle ceremony. A preacher mumbled verses over the grave while Constance sobbed into perfumed handkerchiefs, her grief tangled with rage. Judith stood behind her, still as the cypress trees that framed the yard. She did not bow her head, did not cross herself. Instead, she listened. Beneath the preacher's words, beneath Constance's wails, she heard the earth swallow, slow, patient, final. But death is not the end of cruelty. It is the beginning of rot. That night, Rose Hill changed. The walls, once polished with stolen labor, began to sweat. Wood warped, shutters creaked, doors groaned as if something unseen leaned against them. Rats infested the cellars. Milk soured in the kitchen pails. The dogs refused to bark, their eyes fixed on corners no one else dared to look at. Constance, draped in mourning lace, stalked the halls like a widow queen, her grief curdling into paranoia. She spat at the servants, whipped them for imagined slights, screamed at Judith for moving too quietly, too calmly. "You mock me with your silence," she snarled, striking her across the face with a silver comb. Judith neither flinched nor wept. She only touched her apron pocket where the vial had once been and knew her silence was no longer hers alone. For Rose Hill had swallowed Josiah Bellwether's body, but Judith had planted something deeper. And now the house itself was listening. Constance Bellwether did not sleep after the burial. Nights stretched long and fevered, her eyes ringed with black, her lips chewed raw. She claimed the house whispered, faint murmurs behind the walls, floorboards sighing like breath, doors closing on their own. The other servants heard nothing or pretended not to, But Constance was certain. She tore open cupboards, ripped curtains from their rods, demanded the quarters be searched for witches' charms. None were found, yet the whispers never ceased. It began with small things. The sound of footsteps pacing her chamber when no one was inside. A mirror fogged with breath, though the fire was cold. Candles snuffed themselves as though pinched by unseen fingers. She would scream for Judith, who would arrive silently, a shadow in plain dress, carrying fresh candles or linen. Constance would clutch her, nails digging into Judith's arms. "You hear it too," she pleaded. But Judith only bowed her head, offering nothing but silence. Silence drove Constance deeper into madness. She began to see her husband's face in the windows, bloated, pale, teeth bared in that final rictus grin. At meals she swore her wine soured to blood on her tongue. She accused the cook of poisoning her, the stable boy of plotting against her, the preacher of cursing her with false prayers. One night, she rose screaming from her bed, claiming Josiah had climbed from the grave, mud dripping from his hands as he reached for her throat. The household trembled under her fury. Whippings grew frequent, punishments crueler. But cruelty could not quiet the house. The walls groaned louder. Rats skittered through the rafters in endless swarms. And always, always, there was Judith, moving silently, her presence both balm and torment. For in Judith's stillness, Constance felt the weight of something greater, something watching her through the eyes of the girl she had tried to break. One evening, as dusk bled across the swamp, Constance collapsed before the parlor fire. She clawed at her own gown, shrieking, "He's here! He's here! Josiah's in the walls!" Servants rushed to lift her, but Judith was the one who held her head steady, whispering nothing, only pressing a cool cloth against her brow. And in that silence, Constance knew. She could not name it, could not speak it, but she knew. Judith was no longer just a servant. Judith was the echo of the swamp, the keeper of the silence, and the vessel of her husband's ruin.